Hey guys, welcome to another episode of PB Garage. Thanks a lot for the support you've been giving us in our previous videos. It really helps encourage us and motivate us to produce content like this and continue documenting it. We really enjoy doing these videos, and especially when we get positive feedback from the viewers. So it's fantastic. Thank you. In today's episode, basically what I want to cover is starting the assembly of my 2.7 engine. I've already put the bottom end together. The rotating assembly is fully assembled and balanced and installed in the engine, so I'm not going to cover that. I do have another video where I talk about rod balancing, another video where I talk about putting the engine together, so check that out if you're curious about that aspect of the build. In terms of block prep, Sean just released a video as well covering how he preps his block for his build. So I'm not going to cover that in a lot of detail. So just a quick caveat here, guys, before I get started. I'm not a pro. I do this as a hobby. I'm a guy in a garage shooting a video on YouTube. What I recommend you do is gather as much information as you can from a variety of different sources. I heavily suggest that you lean on the factory service manual, as that's what I've done, and that's where I'm getting a lot of my information for this video. One of the best ways to learn is to ask a lot of questions, so don't hesitate to throw those down below. I'll more than happily go down and answer those as best as I can. Another important thing that I'm going to do is I'm going to try and put part numbers in the description below. Also, I'm going to put corrections to misinformation relating to this video in the description. So before you get any further, just take a look down there to make sure I haven't made any of those notes. And I'm also going to include chapter links below. So if you want something specifically, just go down there, find what you want, click on it, and it'll bring you right to it in the video. So some of the components I'm going to talk about in this video, rear main seal and gasket. Sean talked about that in his video, so I'm going to skim over it lightly here, but that's what I'm going to start with. I'm going to talk about the oil pump and how it gets installed with the timing chain tensioner. Then I'm going to move on to the front sealing flange and the seal, the crankshaft seal that goes in there. I'm going to talk about this in a bit more detail. I'm also going to install things like the water pump and the gasket, some coolant lines that get installed on the block, the engine mounts, some timing components, just quickly install those. And of course the oil pan. So I have both the lower and upper oil pans here. I'm going to cover the process that the factory service manual recommends for installing these. In future videos, I'm going to talk about installing the heads, the turbos, the exhaust manifolds, the cooling system components, power steering components, the timing components in a bit more detail. And then in another video, I want to cover pre-installation checks. So before you put your engine into your car, what to check before you do that, so you reduce the risk of having to take the engine back out to make little corrections to your build. So I think that's enough talking for now. Let's get started on the video. So the first thing I'm going to install is the rear main seal. Like I said, Sean covers this in his video. I'm going to quickly go over how I'm going to do it. It's basically the same thing. Make sure your gasket surface is clean. Use a scraper and get everything off. I've painted this block and I had a little bit of paint that had creeped onto the gasket surface, so I scraped that off. I think it's nice and clean now, ready to go. One thing I recommend doing is bringing it to the floor like this. Watch out for your crankshaft, so supported by wood. I didn't think I'd be able to do this by myself, but then I saw Sean do it in his video, and there was no way that I was going to ask for help after seeing that, so I lugged it over. Just, if you do it yourself, be very careful, don't drop it, and don't hurt yourself. So I'm going to start with the gasket. Just going to slam this on. And then the seal itself. So the seal has this bushing sleeve. Keep that in. If you take it out, I think you can get it back on, but this is a Teflon seal, so it requires no lubrication to the crankshaft, so make sure it's nice and dry, free of oils. So this bushing sleeve centers on the crankshaft itself, so you can't really screw this up. And that's it. Press it down on your dowels and get your hardware. So with the bolts finger tight, I'm going to apply 10 Newton meters to them using a torque wrench. Sean shows a sequence in his video starting from the inside and moving out, so I'm just going to do that. Okay, so the next thing I'm going to install is this oil junction to the turbos, which supplies oil to the turbos. So it mounts on top of the block up here, and then there's a spigot that goes into this bore with an O-ring. So there's an O-ring here, and there's also an O-ring in here where the tube connects to this cast housing. So you want to separate those two and replace the O-ring. And to do that, it's in there pretty tight, but if you grab it and you're able to twist it, and then you can work it out just like that. And you can see, perfect, there's the O-ring that we're going to replace. And we're going to clean this up really well. We're not going to just put an O-ring on here and slam it back in. We're going to clean that out with some degreaser and make sure it's really, really clean. Okay, now that I have the bore really clean, I'm happy with that. I've checked it out. There's no nicks or scratches. I'm ready to take the O-rings off now. Just grab a pick and they will just slide right off. Grab a rag and just make sure that it's nice and clean in there. All right, so we're ready to install the new O-rings. Almost grabbed an old one. You can put these on dry. Before you install this together, use a little bit of engine oil and just moisten the O-ring itself so that it slides smoothly into the bores. And you don't want tons, just moisten it. Yep. There we go. So now this is ready for installation. I'm going to just insert the spigot into the bore and then line up these holes. This gets torqued to 10 Newton meters, and these get torqued to 25 Newton meters. So that covers the rear main seal and oil distribution tube. Now let's get the engine back on the stand. So that was probably one of the most stressful parts of the whole build, installing that rear main seal. They go on easy, but you never know if the lip kind of rolled over or not. You can't check it after it's been installed. You just gotta kind of hope and it doesn't leak once you run the car. So let's move on to the oil pump and its components. So we're gonna start by taking our oil pump and loosely installing it on the engine. We're not gonna bolt it down at this stage. We're gonna wait till later once the oil pan is in place. So just get it mounted up on your engine like that. So for the oil pump chain tensioner, check your old one. Mine has some slight grooves here where the chain rolls over the surface. That's normal. What you don't want to have is the spring being broken, the leaf spring. If you're not sure and your car has high mileage, just get a new one. They're cheap. This was $10 Canadian. It goes on very easily. To install it, I'll bring it a bit closer. Our oil pump is loose. We're gonna slide it onto this dowel and just get it engaged with the chain, and then bend the leaf spring back over this other dowel and push it the rest of the way, and that's it. So let's talk quick about the front flange. I took the seal out. I'm going to replace it. I have a seal here. It's a lip seal from Audi. So this is the OE type. It's PTFE, so it's plastic. There's two types. There's this one and there's also a rubber one. I'd recommend getting the rubber one. I had this in stock at the house and I didn't realize it was an OE type until just today, but the rubber one's a lot easier to install. These ones, you need a special sleeve to get them on. You can try and wiggle it, but they're very, very delicate. The lip on here is very fragile, so if you do it wrong or you nick it, then you're gonna have a leak. So because I have this here, I'm gonna try and install it anyway. I've taken an old socket that I have and I'm gonna use it as my bushing sleeve, so I've machined it to the exact same kind of size as the bottom of this chamfer on the crankshaft. So I'm going to slide it on the socket first, bring that up, and then try and transfer the seal onto the crankshaft. Of course, after I've installed my front flange and gasket, which I'll do now. There's two dowel pins here for the gasket to interface with. No sealant on this, just straight gasket. The front flange, same thing, interfaces with these dowels. Okay, so before I torque this down, I'm gonna have a go at installing this lip seal. I'm gonna use that socket that I talked about earlier. I'm gonna slide it on the socket, bring it right up, and then try and transfer the seal to the crankshaft that way. And then once it's on the crankshaft, I have a larger socket that I'm gonna be able to drive it into the sealing flange housing. So this being a PTFE seal, they recommend no lubrication on the lip here, the outside, or the crankshaft. Just keep it dry. Let's see how this goes. So it goes on nice and easy. I'll line these up as best I can and then Just slide that on like that. And that went on really smooth. Now there's another little bump to get over, which is right there. Up and over it goes. Just some fine tuning here. Now we can drive it in. I can't believe this is actually working. Now I'm going to use my large socket. I'm just going to drive it into the housing flush with the flange housing here. Okay, that went on pretty smooth. The instructions also say don't turn your engine over for 4 hours to let the seal settle on the crankshaft. My crank pin installed, so there's no chance of that happening, and it's definitely not going to run for another 4 hours. It's not going to run for another 4 weeks, I bet. Now I'm going to finish torquing my fasteners. Okay, so our front flange is installed, the seal's installed, my fasteners are torqued, my pump is still loose up here. Next, I think we're ready for the upper oil pan. So to prep for the oil pan to be installed, I'm just going to loosely install 2 fasteners to hold the pump in place. So you see how it wants to slide out of the way because the tensioner is pushing the chain. So just move it to the side where it's supposed to install and start finger tight 2 of these bolts. It doesn't matter which 2, just to hold it in place, and that's it. Just keep it there. So now we're ready to put our upper oil pan on. There's a few things I want to talk about in terms of prep on the block and the pan itself. The first and most obvious is make sure your sealing surface around the block, the front flange, and your rear flange are degreased. They're clean and degreased. So scrape them with a scraper if you haven't already. I mean, at this point you should have had that already done. That goes for the pan itself. Make sure that surface is nice and clean. There's no raised edges. There's no leftover silicone from the previous install. That's ready to go. One note here, so the rear main seal, the gasket that goes between the seal housing and the block, I noticed it was just a little bit raised. So I was able to take my gasket scraper. So I've already done it on this side. I'm gonna do it on this side for you guys. And you can just see how it just takes a tiny amount off. Just an extra precaution so that the pan sits perfectly flat when it comes into this area here. Your holes should be chased and blown out. So the fastener sizes and torque specs, there are 17 M7 bolts and then 2 M8s. The factory service manual says these are M6, but I've measured and they are M7s. And the torque spec for those is 15 Newton meters, and the torque spec on the 8s is 25. So in preparation for this pan to go on, I'm going to use Permatex Ultra Gray. It's a gasket maker that's good for oil pans and the like. Everybody's got a preference, so use what you're comfortable with. I'm going to stick with this one. I've got everything laid out nice and clean, so it's easily accessible. Once I put my bead of silicone down and I drop it onto the block, I've got about 5 minutes to get everything torqued up. So my fastener's accessible, my tools accessible. I've got a cordless drill to help speed things up, just to get them wound down initially, and then I'll go around and do the torquing. I'm going to do, again, a crisscross pattern starting from the center out, and it's going to go back and forth, and that'll bring it down nice and even on the block. For bead size, you want no more than a 3 millimeter wide bead of silicone. If you add more, then you will have some of that seep into the block, and that will clog your oil pickup, and you'll have engine problems. Sean highlighted that in his video for his block prep. Have a look and you can see the consequence of having excess sealant on your flange. The areas I'm going to apply silicone to, it's highlighted in the factory service manual, but you're just going to maintain the inside edge of the oil pan itself. You don't want to go outside the bolts because then you'd have oil seep through the threads. So stick to the inside, like I said, and go all the way around, nice perimeter, 3 millimeter thick. It says to pay particular attention around your rear main seal flange area here. So the reason why it tells us that is because on the oil pan itself here, it's all solid right in this kind of area, but on the block, it's a 90-degree cutout. So there's a big void in this spot of the block. So this is the area I was talking about. You can see how there's no support material under here. So if I had my silicone come over over top of that, on the oil pan, then it wouldn't achieve a seal. So you want to just maintain that perimeter edge on that surface. So I'm just doing a quick test here to see how wide my bead is with that cutout, and I'm at about 3 mil, perfect. So I'm going to continue on with that size of bead. So now that I have my initial bead around, I'm just going to take a look and make sure there's no breaks in the silicone, and just touch up any little areas that look a bit thin. But overall, I think it looks like it's ready to go. There's like one little spot here. So there's 3 kind of locating dowels that you can use when you drop this pan on. So you're gonna kind of aim for those. I'm gonna try for the ones at the back first and then drop the front over this one. So take a bit of force to get it on those dowels. And then once we do that, we'll use our fasteners and secure this in position. Goes without saying, be very careful putting this on. You don't smudge your line. Watch out for your oil pump as you drop this in place. Might not be a bad idea to have a second person to help you. But just look for your dowels at the back. Trust the system. Get your front dowel. Look at your bolt holes, make sure they're lined up. Okay, I think we're good. Starting to go down, perfect. So I'm just gonna get a bit of force. Get it seated on these dowels. I may use a rubber mallet, just, there we go. Okay. Okay, so she's pretty much down. Now I'm gonna start fastening it in position. Just gonna start the bolts, and then I'm gonna use my electric impact to get them finger tight. So now that they're all torqued, I'm just gonna go around and do a double check to make sure I haven't missed any. I'm not gonna add anything else to these fasteners. I'm just gonna make sure that they are snug. Okay, now we're at the stage of installing the tubes that connect to the oil pump. We've installed the new O-rings on there. Before we slide these in, make sure you lube these up with some engine oil. So for this one, you're gonna do the smaller tube first, insert it into the oil pump. Now your pump's loose here, so it gives you a bit of flexibility to move around. That's why we've kept it loose, is so that we can install this lower, or this smaller pipe into the oil pan. Just like that, okay? Now we're good. So I don't see a torque spec for the oil pump bolts in the factory service manual. They are M8s, so I'm going to use the same torque that other M8 bolts are torqued to, and that's 25 Newton meters. So with my oil pump now in place, the shorter of the tubes is in place as well. I'm going to install the longer one. I've already lubed these with a little bit of engine oil. When you're installing this, just be careful in the front flange. There may be a little bit of silicone that you put on between the oil pan and the flange. So yeah, you'll see it once you put this in. If your silicone is still wet, you just want to not get it on the O-ring. And you just work the O-rings into the bores. And that's it. So you have 2 bolts here. Your 2 M6 bolts to hold the tube in place. Torque these to 10 Newton meters. So we've come a long way here. We've got the oil pump in place, we got the tubes, we got the pan, we got the front flange and seal, we got the rear main seal. Now we're gonna move on to installing the lower oil pan. Now traditionally they had a metal gasket, but we're gonna use sealant because I believe the gasket is no longer available. I think you can get it for the 2.8 still, but we're just gonna use the sealant because that works obviously in the application of the pan to the block, so there won't be any reason why that won't work in this application here. For our lower oil pan, we're gonna use the silicone again. So when we do this, it's a bit tricky. So there are no locating dowels on either the upper or the lower pan. So if I were to put some sealant on these faces, this can move around quite a bit. Now if I'm careful, I can probably get it on without disrupting that seal, but I'm gonna take an extra precaution here. And maybe unnecessary, but I've just cut the heads off of some M6 bolts, and I'm just gonna start them in 2 locations. And these will act as locating pins for putting the oil pan in place. So you can just see how that's gonna work there. I can start on the one side and the other, and that way it can't move nearly as much as when there were no pins, and I'll just take these out once I get the bolts going. So same strategy as the upper pan to the block. You're gonna apply a 3mm or no more than 3mm bead all the way around. Again, going on the insides of the bolt holes. Now that you've got your bead laid around, do a visual inspection. Make sure that you don't have any breaks in that bead. Mine looks pretty good. Okay, so once we drop this in place, we're gonna have to move fast again. We got about 5 minutes to get the bolts tightened down. And we're gonna do the same pattern as the upper pan to the block. Again, zigzag pattern. We're just gonna go across like that. And we're just getting them finger tight with this drill. The torque spec for these bolts is 10 Newton meters, again working from the center outwards in a zigzag pattern. Okay, so our pan's tight. We're gonna do the oil sensor next. I've powder coated this lower pan, but I've left the edge where the seal makes contact clean, so there's just bare metal there. So I'm just gonna drop this in place and bolt it down. And these are M6s as well, so I'm gonna torque these to 10 Newton meters. So our oil pan's installed. I'm just gonna put on some accessories now. Oil pressure switch here. Couldn't find a torque spec for this in the Bentley manual, so I'm just gonna use good shop practice and just basically crush that crush washer. That's all, they don't need a lot. For my oil cooler, I don't have the gasket yet, it's coming, so I'm just gonna put the stud in place, and then when I get the gasket, I'll install the oil cooler and the oil filter. Oil drain plug, new crush washer. This gets torqued to 30 Newton meters. Next, I'm gonna install my turbo coolant lines. Now for the other side. These I'm going to torque to 25 Newton meters. It was kind of hard to find something specific in the Bentley, but I think I found it as 25. If you're not comfortable with that, then use your own torque specs. .25 Newton meters again. Now I'm going to install my AC compressor bracket. 25 Newton meters for these three. Okay guys, thanks for sticking around so long. I hope that was informative to you guys. I had meant to install a few more components, but I didn't get around to it. I didn't have a thermostat for my cooling system, so I'm gonna wait and do all the cooling system at the same time in a subsequent video. Same with my timing component. I'm just gonna do one timing video. So I'll stick with the pan, the pump, the brackets on the side, front and rear flanges. I think it's beer time for me. Yeah, everything went smooth, no issues really. So if you see anything that maybe was out of place or something you want more detail on, drop that in the comments below and I'll try and address that to the best of my ability. Thanks again guys, and we'll see you next time.